understanding how to make the appropriate improvements so you can really get to that exemplary level, if at all, wherever possible, on your final draft. And 80 degrees in Florida, somebody's really rubbing our noses in it. Well, enjoy. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and share with you all. Really what I want to focus on for this is the rubric. We've gone through all the critical elements as they're spelled out for you in your in the guide, which again, you know, you've seen it multiple times through these meetings, but it goes through each of those critical elements sort of in layman's terms and explains to you a little bit more broadly how to address each element. So we've done all that in our previous webinars. So now I want to go back to that rubric and make sure that everyone is feeling good about how to interpret that and how to make the pivot from milestone to final project. So let's pull that up. Make sure I pull up the right one for you all. Where are you? Let's try this one. Eco 201 and Eco 202 are here. We have the right one. Perfect. So this is, of course, you all have this in your courses. Let me scroll up to the top so we're all seeing the same thing. So this is ideally what you've looked at multiple times before, but this is an overview of the entire project. So a lot of this is going to be very familiar to you from your work, like I've said, because you've done all these critical elements. So you'll see all the sections that you worked on outlined here in each of the milestones. So this first section, section 1, pardon me, was included in the first milestone, and then sections 2 and 3 were in your second milestone, and sections 4, 5, and 6 were in your last milestone. So you've done all the hard work. Now you're just sort of editing and enhancing based on your instructor's feedback. So that's where the rubric really comes in handy for you to make those enhancements. So this, combined with your individual feedback, is how you're going to really approach putting your final project together. So of course you're going to put the pieces together. So you're going to have one cohesive paper. You're going to have one title page. That title page should reflect your whole paper. And then all the sections are going to go together. Now you do not, in terms of actual putting things together, you don't need to have, we go back up to the sections, you don't need to start each section on a different page, or even each of the subsections, the critical elements. They can flow right from one to the next. And you'll see that in the example paper, and you'll see that as well in the guide that walks you through it. So if you follow that sort of template, you'll be fine. There's no need to space things out onto separate pages. The only thing that will start on its own separate page will be at the end is the reference page. And the abstract is set on its own page as well. So it'll go title page, abstract page, and then your paper begins on that third page and flows straight through all the way through your recommendation until the very end. And then a new page, the references will start. So back to our rubric. Now, and I've talked about this before, but here's where it really matters. You did not have this exemplary column in your milestone grading. Now, the guide to kind of walk you through how to address each of these critical elements did have this exemplary column in mind. So if you really followed that guide to a T and did exactly what it said and in a really thorough and detailed way, you're probably already at exemplary. But on the rubric on your milestone, the highest grade was a proficient. So sometimes, that's one of the things that we have to work around, that you with your instructor and us as instructors with you need to work around to make sure that your feedback addresses that. So sometimes, you might get feedback that's, this is wonderful, this is great, you've done a phenomenal job. And if your feedback doesn't give you any actionable steps to take, most likely you're already at exemplary and you don't have anything to add. I would just, for you to be diligent, I would definitely double check. So go through each of your milestones if you haven't already, and just compare your work to the exemplary column here. Whether or not your instructor, if it seems like your instructor mentioned improvements you could make. Still, you do that due diligence on your end to make sure that your work meets this exemplary level, if that's where you're trying to get, if you're already at proficient. If on the milestone, if you have any elements where you scored needs improvement, then of course your instructor, even for the milestone, had given you feedback on ways to make improvements. So that's less of a gray area. But for anything where you scored proficient, you'll just want to see the comparison between exemplary and proficient to see how you can make that improvement. You might already be there, and your instructor might have explicitly told you that you're already there, but sometimes it's not so clear. So you're going to want to do that for yourself and see how it lines up for you. So some of these, it can be pretty straightforward, and some of them it can be a little trickier, where you'll really need to rely on your instructor's feedback and ask questions here if you have any concerns about how to apply these exemplary descriptions to your work. So the first one, the purpose statement. Now, this exemplary one, and we've said a lot that you might want to come back to this area after your milestone, because when you first write milestone 1, you don't have a lot of expertise on your company. You haven't done all your research yet. Now we're in week 7, you've submitted 3 milestones, you've done all of your research, you're in a really good place to come back to this and really flesh it out. So the exemplary column here specifically says, if we read under introduction purpose and the exemplary description, it says it meets proficient criteria and uses industry-specific language to establish expertise. So before, to get a proficient, you might have just been a little bit vague, which would be fine, in saying what you were going to do. So you might have said something very basic, like, in this paper, this paper will analyze the supply and demand conditions, price elasticity of demand, cost implications, and overall market for Coca-Cola Company, and see how that impacts their future profitability. You might have just said something very basic like that. And that's absolutely fine for the milestone, to get a proficient, to get a perfect score on the milestone. To bump that up to exemplary, you're going to need to revisit that and drag it out a little bit and use some of that, like it says, industry-specific language, stuff that's unique to your industry and your firm, the firm that you chose, to talk a little bit more about those microeconomic principles that you're looking at, the supply and demand, the price elasticity of demand, the costs, and the overall market for your firm. So this way it will be a little bit more specific to your paper, because that sentence I said, this paper will analyze supply and demand, I could just change the name of the company and it would be the same for every single student. So this is where you're going to make it a lot more specific to your firm and the overall industry that your firm is in. So that's a pretty clear-cut way of how to make that pivot that you'll be very, very well prepared to do now that you've done all your research. Right, so I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. I know Ellen's keeping up great, so thank you, Ellen. All right, so the next one, this one is, something that you probably won't be able to change. The introduction, history, and overview, the exemplary column is saying meets proficient criteria and choice of company is well suited to the analysis. Of course, you can't change your company, so either you're there or you're not at this point. So that's why we have students work closely with their instructor when they choose their company during week 1 to make sure that they're all set for that. And that's why we also give the suggested company list. So anybody who picked from the suggested company list should definitely, if you got a proficient on your milestone, you'll definitely be exemplary here. John, Derek, it looks like maybe you picked off the list. Just because you picked off the list doesn't mean it's suitable, but it's a guarantee that if you picked from the list, it's suitable. If you got explicit permission from your instructor, then I would hope that they would mark this as exemplary. If you got proficient on your milestone, then you should be bumped up to exemplary here, since that's the only difference between the two. There's plenty of great choices outside of the suggested list, but we like to keep the list on the smaller side, and we like to pick companies that we know students have been successful with. So, but every once in a while, students will surprise us with really great choices that they're able to find the right information for, and they do really well. So we definitely don't want to limit you to just that list, but it is there to make things easier. So. All right, so as we go on, I mean, I don't want to belabor it and go through everything, but what I want you to notice is that for exemplary, it's always going to say that you meet the proficient and then you do something above and beyond that to get to that point. So you'll see with the conditions, supply and demand conditions, the impact and supply and demand conditions, firms' actions. Both of them are looking for detailed reasons or concrete examples. So this is a great example where you can go back to your work and you might have mentioned something that was a little bit broad, like for instance the Coca-Cola example, since I used that already. You might say that people are looking to find ways to cut sugar out of their diets. And that's a great example of a trend in demand that's impacting the industry. But you could take that one step further and explain detailed reasons for that trend. So was there a scientific paper that was put out? Did the American Medical Association say something against high fructose corn syrup or sugar intake in general? So you can really find ways to flesh that out. If you think that, if you know that you're only at the proficient level based on your milestone, or if you're at the needs improvement level, then you can use that, you can have that sort of exemplary in mind to make improvements to get past that needs improvement level if that's where you were on your milestone. So that's these are the ways that now that you've done your research and you've got the basics down, you can find areas where you can expand and really dive deep to make sure that you're meeting that exemplary level if that's what you're aiming for. So we can go down and take a look at a couple more. Those are, I think the conditions, which is the supply and demand section of your paper, are pretty straightforward. In the price elasticity section, again, it's going to look for ways for you to go into a little bit more detail. So two of these, the first one, which is price elasticity of demand analyze, and the third one, price elasticity of demand pricing decisions, both are asking you to use research to illustrate your claims. So again, if that's something that you think that you didn't do in your milestone, that's a really great way to go look, see if you can find a little bit more research based on something that you've already got in your paper. So we don't want you to reinvent the wheel, but maybe you mentioned something, a pricing decision by your company, or some price elasticity of demand trends in your industry that you can go and find some additional research to support. That's a great way to enhance this if you think that's what you need to bump you up from the proficient level to the exemplary level. For the second price elasticity of demand element, consumer responsiveness, this one is very straightforward. So this is some low-hanging fruit. To get from, if you're at proficient now and you need to get to exemplary, all you have to do is review all the factors of elasticity. Now those are spelled out in our textbook very clearly, and we've linked to that and listed them in the final project guide. So you have them all listed for you there. You know exactly what you need to do. And all you need to do is any of them that you missed, you need to go in and sort of apply them to your firm's products or services. Maybe those are the ones that didn't tell as compelling a story or you didn't feel were as important. And that's fine. That's why the milestone is the milestone and this is the final draft. But you can go in and explain those and maybe explain, their impact. Maybe their impact is smaller than the other factors of price elasticity. If that was the reason, maybe you didn't include them the first time. So that's a very easy way to make sure that you get to exemplary from a proficient level on the milestone. Now, going further down to the cost section, again, this is, whoops, blew right by it. The first one, costs of production, profitability. This is another example where they want you to add concrete examples to substantiate your claims. So we'll stick with the Coca-Cola example. All the stuff I'm saying about Coca-Cola, if anyone on this call or listening to the recording did Coca-Cola, I don't know that this is actually accurate. I'm just using it as a hypothetical, so please don't quote me in your paper. But let's say that for Coca-Cola, the cost of sugar, a major input in producing Coca-Cola or high fructose corn syrup, has gone up, and you mention that in your paper. That would maybe get you to the proficient level, or that's part of what would get you to the proficient level. So to get to exemplary, you need to provide concrete examples to substantiate your claims. So maybe you want to put in a graph or a table that shows the actual increase in the price of sugar, instead of just saying the price of sugar has increased. Both say the same thing, but when you give that concrete example, like, oh wow, these are the sugar prices over the past 5 years, look how they've increased. They've increased 10% every year. That tells a much more compelling story than just saying sugar prices have increased. So that's a way that you move from proficient to exemplary using this rubric. I actually don't even drink Coca-Cola. I don't know why I picked that. I used to drink a lot of Coca-Cola, and then I stopped drinking soda. So maybe that's why I picked it, because I am part of the trend of people not having as many sugary drinks in their diet. It's my bias coming out. But no, these are why we have a lot of consumer products on the suggested companies list, because I think they're really easy for students to relate to in terms of these microeconomic principles. A lot of this stuff, once you learn it, can sort of become common sense. And if you have a product that you understand very well because you've consumed it, then it's really easy to apply a lot of the stuff and to understand it. So whereas some other companies like a bank or an insurance company, their products are a little bit more esoteric. So it's harder to do all this work for those companies. So we like to pick companies that have products or services that customers are really familiar with. So that's why I could talk about Coca-Cola very easily, even though I don't love it. So moving on, the next one in cost of production, for exemplary, it asks you to meet proficient and provide insight into how the firm can manage those costs. So this is one example of probably all of them before you get to the recommendation section, where they're sort of asking you to look towards a recommendation. You're not going to give your full recommendation like you will in the recommendation section, but if you think you need to make the move, if you're not already at exemplary for this one, you might look to see, this is a really great way, again, to take advantage of the work that you've already done. You've already written your recommendation at this point. So you might want to come back, look at your recommendation, see some things that you recommended. If you recommended anything about managing costs in your recommendation, which you did have space for, you could have gone in a different direction, but you definitely had one of the critical elements does deal with that. See what you wrote there, and if you can bring it back to here, that's a great way to do this. And then you're giving yourself credit here for cost of production output decisions, getting yourself to exemplary, but you're really just leveraging work that you've already done. So that's a great way to do that. If you haven't in either spot, here in cost of production output decisions or in the recommendation sections, talked about any way that the firm can manage their costs, then that's a great time to do it. You look at the costs the firm has in terms of their fixed versus variable costs, and just think of a way that they could, something they could do that references the balance between those two things. So again, with the sugar example, the price of sugar increasing, I'll stick with that. Again, a hypothetical, I don't know if sugar is increasing in price. You might recommend, maybe a change in the formula. Now, Coca-Cola probably wouldn't do that, but that's something you could recommend. You could recommend using a different kind of sweetener. You could recommend a focus on other products that use less sugar. You could recommend a whole lot of things. So those are just some ways you could go if that is the case, that sugar was increasing and that's the kind of thing that you want to talk about, that it's a large variable cost that they're trying to manage. So lots of ways you could go with that. But just think about the stuff that you talked about already in your cost section and anything you talked about in your recommendation section, and see what you can pull out of that. So John asks, now these recommendations go in the last section that we did in milestone 3, right? Yes. So you've already done your recommendations. It was 3 separate critical elements, all under the heading of recommendations. So those were in milestone 3. That's going to be the end of your paper. You don't need to do anything after that for the final draft. Those 3 pieces of the recommendation, that's it. Your paper's done. You might, again, like we're going through here, you might want to edit those based on the feedback you got from your instructor, but that is how your paper ends with those recommendations. Hope that answers your question, John. All right, so moving on to the overall market part. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll make sure we get through everything. And please post your questions if you're confused about anything in the rubric, or if you have any other specific questions. That's what we're here for. So overall market, the market share, this one, again, this one's pretty straightforward. It asks you to present, for the exemplary, it asks you to present the data graphically and over time. So a lot of the times, if you were at Proficient, you might have already had the data, but maybe you just wrote it in a paragraph style, and you didn't put it in any sort of chart or table. So this is a great opportunity, some low-hanging fruit. Put it in a graph. Market share, this is a great one for a pie chart. It asks you to do it over time. So you might want to compare 2 separate years to show the growth. So you can have a pie chart for 1 year and then a pie chart for a year in the past, and see the difference between the 2. You could do a line graph and show them changing. You could do bar graph. Really, I mean, anything that's going to, you want to make sure that you choose something that makes sense for the information you're trying to convey. But anything that's going to get your point across, that shows the change in market share across the few companies that you've looked at, and show that graphically, that's going to do the trick here in the exemplary section. All right, so the next one is the barriers to entry in overall market. So if you're at Proficient, to go to exemplary, you're going to need to provide specific examples of successful and or failed entrants into the market. So this is I think a really interesting one, and again, you might have already done it, but this gives you a chance to see really see how the barriers to entry have played out in the real world. So for instance, I'm going to switch from Coca-Cola, but Nike is one of the companies on our list, and they're obviously a very well-known brand that has a lot of market power because of their brand. So the fact that Under Armour was able to make such a big splash in that market was probably a little bit surprising to some customers, because it had been like Nike and Reebok and Adidas for so long, and then Under Armour came in and they were able to be a successful entrant into that market. And we have them on our suggested list too, so maybe some of you are doing Under Armour. But of course, that would be an example that you could talk about. So Another great thing about this is that you already know a lot of the competitors from your research on market share. So maybe some of the competitors in the market share section have been new entrants into the market that have come up and recently and been successful. And then, there might be some failed ones that obviously you wouldn't talk about in market share if they were failed, but that you might find information on and want to share here to sort of prove your point. So if there's a failed entrant, you want to make sure that if they failed, what barrier was it that they couldn't overcome? So make sure that you're putting those pieces together. On either the successful side, how were they able to overcome the barrier, or the failed entrant side, how were they not able to overcome the barrier? All right, so I see some questions about graphs. Okay, it looks like Ellen's got it. Yep, I would definitely agree with Ellen to keep your graph in the place where you're talking about it. I know that there are some academic papers that refer you to a page way at the end. That is definitely not the expectation or the requirement for this paper. So, especially with this paper, you'll have a decent number of graphs, but you're not going to have pages and pages of graphs like some academic papers do. So I definitely agree with Ellen that it's best to keep it in the spot where you have it. Makes the most sense for the reader. If that was the question, so. All right. And yeah, another thing about APA, APA, really, the strictness of the APA for this course really is the focus on the citations themselves. We do want the title page to be in APA format, but some of the smaller details of the APA within the paper, we're not looking for at the same level. So really, we want you to be focusing on making sure your citations are done properly, the in-text citations and the reference list. So in terms of, labeling graphs, if you know how to do that in APA, wonderful. If that's not something you're familiar with, I don't want anybody to sweat that too much, because you have a lot of work to do. So do the best you can when it comes to that, and just take a look at the example paper, the student example paper that we shared, and that will maybe help give you some guidelines about what it looks like in a finished product. All right, so we've just got a couple more minutes. The overall market structure, again, this is one where you're going to provide some specific examples to demonstrate the market structure and the firm's influence. So that might be an example of when the firm did something that influenced the overall market, if they're in that kind of a market, or other examples that prove that the market structure is the structure that you've identified it as. So if the structure is monopolistic competition, you'd expect to see a lot of entrants coming in and out of the market because it's pretty low barriers to entry in that sort of market structure. So you'd want to provide some specific examples that would back that up. So again, that's just adding some more detail from the proficient level to get you to the exemplary level. And then in the recommendation section, which I feel most students generally do pretty well in this area, a lot of these will just make sure that you're relating all of your recommendations to the economic principles. So that's what the first one says. Make sure that your recommendation is related to economic principles presented in the paper. This one particularly focuses on costs and supply, but you can go a little bit broader than that in this first one here. The second recommendation section, recommended action, is looking for you to provide advice for how the company can strengthen its position in the market. So this is, again, where you can leverage some of the things you talked about in the overall market section, some things the company can do to gain some market share and improve their ability to influence the overall market. And lastly, the sustain its success. To get to the exemplary level, you're going to provide specific ideas for how the firm can sustain its success. So this is where students get really creative, and that's why I think most students generally do really well on this, even from the milestone, and don't need to add a lot here. But if you read over your comments from your instructor, and if you read it over yourself and think that you're not yet at the exemplary level, this is where you can sort of, like I said, get a little creative and think of some specific ideas for what your company can do to keep being successful or to become more successful if they're struggling. Yes, and Ellen mentions, don't forget elasticity in that final section. Yeah, so this final recommendation, sustain its success, does want you to more specifically look at trends in demand and the price elasticity of demand for your product. So the price elasticity of demand has implications for pricing, but also maybe the kind of product or service that your company gives or provides rather. Maybe there's something an action they can take that could change the price elasticity and make it more price inelastic, for instance. Maybe if you can convince your customers that they cannot live without your product, then it becomes less sensitive to price, and that is often a good thing for companies. So that's a way that those are two ways you can look at price elasticity, from a pricing perspective and from a product perspective. So thank you for bringing that up, Ellen. Yes, yes. So these points all add up to 100%. In the rubric where you get scored, just like from the milestone, you should see that that it tells you the percentage and the points. So you should be able to see both. I think from the student view, you're able to see both, but it is worth 300 points, the final, and this is the percentage breakdown for each section. But we're at 9 o'clock and we got through everything. So Thank you all so much. If I missed any questions, you can throw them up real quick before we switch over to our ECO 202 students who are waiting patiently. But looks like we're pretty good. All right, thank you all so much for coming, all the ECO 201 people. ECO 202, I'm going to go ahead and pull up your class now. All right, so for ECO 202 students, you actually do have some new work in your final project. So that's what we're going to spend most of our time focused on today. Now let me pull up your... All right, so I want to go over your rubric, and I also want to go over the guide itself for ECO 202. Because there's a couple things that we like to focus on in this final project webinar. The first is, of course, for you guys specifically in ECO 202, the fact that you've got 4 new critical elements that you didn't do in any of your milestones. They're brand new for the final. And then also the fact that on the final, there are 4 performance levels instead of just 3 like we had in the milestones. And I know I've talked about this a bit before in past webinars, and hopefully your instructors mentioned it, and hopefully you've noticed it when you looked at the milestone rubrics compared to the final project rubric. But to refresh your memories, the milestone rubric only has 3 proficiency levels, with the highest level being proficient. So if you were at the proficient level on your milestone, that gets you 100% score. But it doesn't mean that you don't have room for improvement. The milestone is treated in that sense like a rough draft. So you can get a perfect score, but still have room to make some additions and some edits. And then the final project comes, and you've got this whole new column, this whole new performance column called exemplary, that outlines what additional thing you need to do to improve upon your project. Now, what I want you to know is that the guide that we created for you was designed with the final project in mind. So if you followed the guide exactly and in a really detailed and thorough way, you should already be at exemplary. Some of this stuff, it would be difficult to be at exemplary until we get to the end of the term, because you haven't gone through all of the modules in the course. So especially the milestone 1, that was the case. So milestone 1, you probably, even if you scored a proficient, there's probably some stuff you want to enhance now that you know more about macroeconomics. But there might be some of these where you were already at the exemplary level, and your instructor hopefully gave you feedback to that effect, that you did a wonderful job, nothing to add here, something along those lines. So you'll want to take a look at your feedback and a look at the rubric together to see if you need to do anything. So read your feedback, look at your own work, and then look at the exemplary column if you got proficient on your milestone, and see, does my work really match up with the exemplary if I'm already at proficient? Or do I need to do something more on my final draft to get to this exemplary level? So that's the case for each of the critical elements. So that's a pretty decent amount of work in and of itself. Obviously, it's not as much work as creating all this stuff from scratch. So this shouldn't take you as long as when you actually had to write the elements. But you definitely want to go through each one really carefully and make sure that anywhere you see that you can make an improvement, that you try to do so. You don't want to leave any points on the table. So I really want to get to the new elements, so I'm not going to go through each of these exemplaries just yet. If we do after we go through the new elements, then we'll do that. But I just really want to reiterate that for you all to set aside some time, pull out your milestone feedback, pull out your work here. I'm sorry, pull out your work, your actual milestone submissions, along with the feedback, and pull out this final project rubric and look at all 3 and see if there's any improvements you can make on any of your critical elements. All right, quickly, I'm going to scroll down. You'll see that for the most part, these critical elements go in order of how you did them on your milestone. But there is one exception, and that's the two of the 4 new elements that you're going to be doing. you'll see that here these first 5, examination of GDP, growth and trend, examination of GDP output, unemployment events, and interest rates, those were the first 5 on your first milestone. Those were the 5 elements on your first milestone. But in this section, there's also 2 more that you didn't do the first time around because we hadn't covered it yet. And that's the foreign trade section. So this is going to come when you put your final project together, right after the slides on interest rates. You're going to add in at least one slide on foreign trade imports and exports, and then another slide on foreign trade economic models. So ideally, you'll put that right in there so that your order of your slides matches up with this rubric. So these are 2 of those new elements, and we'll go over those in the actual PowerPoint in a second. And then the other 2 new ones are going to come at the end, so you'll tack those on. So you'll see after the foreign trade, the 2 foreign trade ones, comes the fiscal policy, which you did on milestone 2. And then after fiscal policy comes the the monetary policy ones, which was milestone 3. And then the final 2 that are new for the final are conclusion, trends and outcomes, and conclusion, agreement, or disagreement. So you'll be able to add those now that you've done all your work. And we will pivot over to those now. I will share the guide that goes through those. Let me just scroll through my stuff here and see if I can find it for you. Oh, that is not the one. Bear with me, guys. Nope. I've got way too many files in here with the 2 classes. Okay, I might need to go grab it. Here we go. No, I got it. All right. So this is this is in everyone's course, just like the other file I just showed you, which was the guidelines and rubrics. This is in all of our courses in the final project resource area. So this is the guide for the entire project. So you'll recognize a lot of this because it has all the stuff from the milestones in it. But now everything's in order as it should look for your final project. So you're going to start with your presentation slide, the overview, which was from milestone 1, and then you go from there into the GDP slides. So you'll recognize this from milestone 1, unemployment and inflation, interest rates. And now is where you'll see the new stuff. So this is where we're going to show the 2 new foreign trade sections. So we did foreign trade in week 6. So now you're able to write about that. So that's why it wasn't included in any of the milestones. So the first critical element that you're going to add for your final is foreign trade imports and exports. And this element is asking you to provide data on levels of imports and exports throughout your decade. So just like all the other data that you've collected, we really want to see this on an annual basis. I've given a couple of different ways you can show it. You might want to look at the value of imports and exports in real inflation-adjusted dollars, or you can show them as a percentage of GDP. I've seen both ways. They might tell a slightly different story, but really both would work for this and qualify. And both are going to show you a trend. So you really want to see how it looked overall in your decade. Were imports and exports both increasing, which just basically tells us that trade overall was increasing? Was one going down and the other one going up? And that tells you there's been a switch in our trade balance. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking for. That you really have to get the data for every single year to be able to say one way or the other what's happening. And then once you've got the data and you present it, just like you did with the other stuff, you're going to present it in a graph, ideally. Some students have done it in a table. That's okay too. Once you've got your data on your slide, then you can get into the analysis part. So in your analysis of the data, you're going to make connections to other aspects of the economy, such as the exchange rate. So again, this was something that we covered in week 6, so now you're able to sort of apply this. So we've given an example here of what might have been part of the story. So, if there's a change in the exchange rate, how does that play into the imports and exports levels that you see, for instance? Or there might have been something else that, that affected it. But you want to look for maybe some explanation for any trend that you observe. And then we've got some links to help you get started on where to find the data. Now, these links don't go to the Census Bureau. They go to a website. I believe it's called Trading Economics. I can't click on it here to bring you guys while we're in Adobe, but hopefully you might have checked this out already. But it takes you to a website that displays graphs using Census Bureau data. So you can, that's just a really good place to start. You can grab their graphs, or you can go directly to the Census Bureau. It shouldn't be too difficult to find the data. If you get the data in a table, you can make your own graph, pretty straightforward, using, PowerPoint or using Excel. You can import really easily into PowerPoint without a problem. Yeah, good point, Ellen. And also your week 6 discussion, we talked about trade. So the idea with that is that you've maybe already done a little bit of this research already, and you have some spots where you can find information about import and export data from your time period. So that's basically how you're going to address this element. And again, if you follow this and you do a very thorough job, you should already be at the exemplary level. But always make sure that you go back to the rubric and are comparing your work to what that exemplary column says. So you sort of know what you're aiming for. I don't want anyone to miss out on something that was very easy to do, and you just didn't know you had to do it. So always make sure to check that to see what it's asking of you, so you don't miss out on points you could have earned. All right, so then there's one more slide for foreign trade, and this one is foreign trade models. So this is looking for you to, again, like we've done with a lot of our other milestones, is bring in those macroeconomic models to explain a little bit more about the role of trade in the economy. So you've already got your data on the last slide, and now you can relate the trade levels to events within the economy or within our trading partners' economies. So you already know a lot about the events that happened in your decade because you did that in milestone 1, and now you've got the trade data. So now you're just looking to tell a story with those two. So, we've got an example here. The Great Recession saw incomes decrease in most of the Western world. So imports and exports dropped altogether, and we can show that with the ADAS model. That's one way where you can bring in an event and show it through a model and how it affected trade. So all the 3 things can be wrapped up very neatly with an example like that. So you'll want to look for examples in your own research. Now, it might be, and again, you can leverage your work, and from the discussion board, it might be that there was trade policy that affected this. So trade policy might lower the cost of trade if you're lowering tariffs. So that is going to have an impact, and you can discuss that. And that comes more into sort of the comparative advantage. So you might not use the actual mathematical model like the ADAS model that uses a graph, but more of a theoretical model like this one, like comparative advantage, where you're basically just talking about the flows of trade and who specializes in what, and use that as your kind of major macroeconomic concept that you're discussing in terms of an event that happened. In this case, the event is, maybe a new trade agreement. So each decade is going to be a little bit different. Some decades, trade plays a much bigger role than others. If you have a decade where trade does not play as big of a role, that's okay. Just talk about it, say what it did. And, if there's not a lot of trade, you can talk about why there wasn't a lot of trade. Maybe it was, had to do with costs. Maybe it had to do with lack of trade agreements, that, trade was too difficult. Countries were closed off. Maybe demand in other countries wasn't strong enough to allow for trade. there might be lots of reasons, but if trade was a small part of your decade, you can, find a little bit of evidence to explain why that might be. And then for those of you who have decades where trade is a huge part of the economy, like, recent times, you won't have that problem. You'll be able to get lots of data about trade, and you'll see that it's a big part of the overall GDP, and decisions about the economy overall always impact trade, now that trade is sort of inextricable from the overall U.S. economy. So very different depending on which time period you're in. But everyone can still tell their story. That's really the most important part. All right, so now, like I showed you in the rubric, when you put your paper together, your project together, fiscal policy will come in next. This is the work you did in milestone 2. Again, you're going to be reviewing your feedback, reviewing the rubric, seeing what improvements you can make, and adding to it as needed. So that will come next. These 3 or more slides, but those 3 critical elements. And then straight into milestone 3 stuff, the monetary policy slides, should be 3 or more slides. And then we get into the last 2 additional slides. So the first one is conclusions. And let me just say that students generally do very well on this. So if you follow the rubric closely, you should have no problem, because really you're just wrapping up what you've already done. So if you've done a pretty good job throughout your presentation, this should be very straightforward for you. So for this element, you're going to take a look at all the data, the history, and the policy analysis that you've already presented and summarize it in just a coherent and thorough manner. So this is your time to tell the economic story of the decade. And just be sure to use specific examples here. If there's any one thing that students forget to do, I would say it's that. So they might talk about the specific policies that were put in place in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy, and they might talk about big events that happened, but they forget to bring in specific data points. So really, I think that that's something you can very easily include because you have it, so don't forget to do it when it's just sitting there waiting for you to include. And then lose points and maybe not get to that exemplary or proficient level because you forgot to do that. So make sure when you're including examples that you're including examples of the policy and the events and also the actual numbers. So if it's that, GDP had unprecedented growth, and give those numbers. If it's that unemployment reached an all-time high in this year, say what it was and say what year it was. So use those sorts of specific data points that really highlight the major economic swings throughout your 10-year period. The rest, I think everyone has a really easy time with the events and the policy. So quick note on this one, because some students, again, forget to do this, like sometimes happens with some of the other slides. You still do need to have the notes section. So your slide could be, there's really nothing new to present here. So you're probably not going to have a new graph here, most likely. So most students just keep it like a bulleted list, or some students try to get some interesting graphics to put in there, like picture type graphics, just to make it look a little bit more interesting visually. But really, you're just going to want to keep the basics on the slide, like we always say, and then a more thorough explanation in the notes area. So you don't want a ton, again, you don't want a ton of text on your slide. This is one slide where students can really put a lot of text on the slide that should be in the notes section. So that's another common mistake that students make on this slide. It's more stylistic, but again, part of the reason we want you to do this PowerPoint presentation is because we want to help you with your PowerPoint skills. So it's never a great idea to have tons of text on a PowerPoint slide that when you're given a presentation. And then the last one, so this is the very last element that you have to add, the fourth one. This is your chance to talk about what you think about all the stuff that happened in your 10-year period. So we call it the agree or disagree. So you're going to state whether you agree or disagree with the fiscal and monetary policy actions taken. Now, that's at least two different things. You know, there was monetary policy and there were fiscal policy actions. But even within that, the government and the Federal Reserve probably did a number of things. Some of those things you might have thought were effective, and some of those things, based on your research and the data, you felt were not effective. So this isn't an all or nothing. You can break it down on a, like we say here, on a case-by-case basis and say, well, these are the policies that I thought were effective, and these were the policies that I did not think were effective. So I don't agree with these choices, but I agree with these other choices. As long as in your argument, you're sure to use economic models and concepts to support your feeling about whether you agree with it or disagree with it or not. So we've got an example here that you could say that, you know, you don't agree with the government spending money on programs because it's not fair to give money to people. That is not to say it's not a legitimate reason to disagree with a policy, but it's not based on macroeconomic models or concepts. So really, we want to just focus on things that are based on macroeconomic reasoning. So if you want to say that, you know, I disagreed with increased spending because the expansionary fiscal policy created too much inflation, that is something that you can prove with the data. You can show the increased inflation, and it aligns with our macroeconomic models. So that's really where we want you to focus your agreement or disagreement on any of these policies. You know, especially when we're in an election year, like we were this year, it's really easy to have non-economic based feelings about government policies, and that's fine. But for this specific assignment, we just really want to focus on the economics of it. So make sure that you stick to that. And just like always, keep the basics on the slide itself, and then the details in the notes. So what some students have done is they've sort of made one side agree and one side disagree and sort of listed the things that they agreed with and disagreed with quickly why, and then a deeper discussion in the notes. I think that that's a pretty straightforward way. You might not, maybe you agreed with everything that happened in your decade, and then you might not have that similar kind of breakdown, so you might just want to do like a bulleted list. Whatever works for you. Again, you just want your slide to be nice and clean, not have too much text, and then have all the big explanation in the notes section. So we have a decent amount of time left. We have about 7 minutes left. So if there's any questions, now's the time to ask them. We do have these 4 new elements. I can't stress that enough because we do see a lot of final submissions submitted with some of these elements missing. So if I keep repeating that, it's just because I don't want anyone to lose out on any points because they forgot to do any of these 4 new elements. But if there are no questions, we can go back to the rubric and take a look at that and look at some of those moves from proficient to exemplary while we have a few minutes left. I see a couple people typing, so I'm just going to make sure there's no questions before I leave this. Yes, thank you, Ellen. Definitely go through all of your milestones and make sure you've got notes on all of the slides. Proficient to exemplary. Great. All right, Mandy. We will pop back over to that. And we'll go through as much of it as we can. All right, so let's go to the top of the rubric so we can take a look. So again, this is in all of your courses. This is the, I believe it's, if I get the title right, Final Project Guidelines and Rubric. So let's start at the top. So we definitely won't be able to get through everything, so I'll try to make some broad summaries of these. The first one, the exemplary, so for the growth rates and trends. To get to exemplary, you need to explain the relevance of the growth rates observed. So here's where you're going to want to throw in some specific language that shows your understanding of the business cycle. So you can use the term business cycle. That's one. You might say an expansionary period, recession, expansion, slow growth, things of that sort that show that you understand, okay, well, growth was negative here. What does that mean? That means a recession. Growth was increasing here. That's an expansion. Those are the sorts of things that we're looking for in terms of relevance of the rates that you see. You'll see a lot of this nuanced insight into the relationship between events and national output. That, agreed, can be a little bit vague, but really what it's looking for is for you to show that you really understand the relationship between the two. So a lot of the times, all it takes is for you to just go into a little bit more detail about whatever it is. In this case, it's about the relationship between the events and national output. So to show that nuanced insight, it might mean just going a little bit deeper into your explanation or finding some more examples to support whatever it is that you spelled out. So that, again, if you look at your work, anytime where you see that, just think about, if you don't think you're already there based on your feedback and based on what you see in your own work, just think about ways you can expand what you've already got if you're at proficient, and how you can go into a little bit more detail in each of those areas. Read an idea and think, what can I add to this to show that I really understand it? And especially in these first few from milestone 1, you'll know a lot more now, and that will really come in handy here. So this is probably where you're going to spend most of your time, is in the milestone 1 stuff. The fiscal policy and the monetary policy, those matched up a little bit better in terms of timing with the course, since those we looked at specifically, and then you did your milestone right there. Whereas these, definitely having done the whole course, coming back to the GDP, the unemployment, and the inflation and the interest rates, you'll just have a much better picture to really enhance these. Oh, Mandy keeps losing sound. I hope she's not. And hopefully when the recording come out, you can come back to the recording. But Mandy, if there's anything specific that you want me to address, I'm happy to address it in terms of any specific critical elements. This one here, this last page, this top page, unemployment, output, and growth. This one is a very easy way to get to exemplary. So to get to exemplary, all you have to do is explain how the unemployment and inflation data is collected and calculated. So that stuff is from our textbook. And of course, you can find tons of explanations for this online through simple Google search. So that is an example of low-hanging fruit. This is a very easy one to make sure that you're getting the exemplary on. We'll take a look at a couple others that I want to highlight if they're very ones I don't want you to miss out as being easy targets. So the foreign trade one, I know this is a new one, but to get to exemplary, this one asks for specific detail in presenting the data. So you give your graph in a lot of these, and this is an example. You might show a graph of imports and exports, but some specific detail in presenting the data might be talking about trade with specific countries, if any of that was a driver and the ups and downs you see in imports and exports. Or again, with the exchange rate, you might add an exchange rate graph or something to give a little bit more detail in presenting your data. So those are a couple ways you can do that. The unemployment events, which is this first one here, again, this is another one that asks for a nuanced insight into the relationship between events, unemployment, and inflation. So that's just an area where, again, you're going to want to read over what you have and just see how you can go deeper or add some additional examples to really show your understanding. And the next one, in interest rates, interest rate fluctuations to get to exemplary. You're going to relate the fluctuations to all other factors of the economy. So any fluctuations you see in the interest rate, the interest rate generally, because it's set by a base level by the Federal Reserve, it's going to go up and down in response to the economy. But so it has a causal effect in both directions. So when something happens in the economy, now that you've done your monetary policy section, you know that the Federal Reserve responds by trying to influence interest rates. But also, once an interest rate changes, that has a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. So something happens to the economy that makes the Federal Reserve change the inflation rate, the interest rate. So that's one way of looking at it. Why did the interest rate get changed to begin with? And then once the rate is changed, how does that affect the rest of the economy? So you want to make sure you're looking at both sides of that to flesh out this critical element and really hit that exemplary mark. All right, we are a little past 9:30, so I'm going to quickly, if anybody wants to hang on, look at the fiscal policy and monetary policy. These are set up pretty much the same in terms of the language in the rubric. So you'll notice that a lot of this is asking you to rely on scholarly research. So ideally you already have that, so a lot of you are probably already at exemplary. If you got a proficient score on your milestone and you used and cited scholarly research to support the information you presented, then you're probably already good for this. So that's a good point there. And then again, a lot of these exemplaries, like you can see here with the impact, using concrete examples to substantiate your claim. Again, that could be research, could offer those concrete examples, and data, which we, of course, in our milestone reviews, we encouraged you to bring in. So again, all of your guides and all of our webinars from the past did already have this exemplary in mind. So a lot of you, if you got a proficient on your milestone, you might already be here. So don't be surprised if you feel like you've already done a lot of the exemplary work, which is great. You'll save yourself a lot of time. All right, well, we're already a few minutes past, so I'm going to thank you all so much for coming. And if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to your instructor or to reach out to me. You can put my name, my email down here in the chat. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have about the stuff we went over tonight. And if you have any questions about your feedback, do not hesitate to ask your instructor. If you don't understand what you can do to incorporate their feedback, or if you don't understand what they're trying to say with their feedback, ask them now, because you only have a few days left and they really are looking for you to incorporate the advice they gave you in your milestones. So you don't want to miss out on that, because they're definitely going to be looking for it. Kevin, I'm so glad to hear that. And happy holiday season to you as well. We have Christmasica this year. My neighbor celebrates Hanukkah. We celebrate Christmas, and I found out that Hanukkah starts on Christmas this year, so that's super cool. And all the other fun winter holidays. So, all right, well, everyone have a wonderful time finishing up your projects, and then after the term's over, a wonderful break. Thank you all so much for coming.